Good evening and welcome to Worldview Channel 247. I'm Jack, bringing you the latest developments in the unfolding Israel-Iran crisis, along with pivotal reactions from the United States, Russia, Ukraine, and beyond. Over the past week, Israel has launched an unprecedented air campaign striking deep into Iranian territory. Despite early tactical successes, analysts are now questioning whether Jerusalem's ambitions can be achieved without broader support and what this means for the region's future. In the initial hours of June 13th, the Israeli Air Force unleashed a series of precision raids targeting key Iranian military and nuclear installations. Jerusalem declared its objective was clear: to eliminate once and for all the existential threat posed by Tehran's nuclear and ballistic missile programs. Yet just days into the campaign, unexpected challenges emerged. Iranian air defenses, long thought vulnerable, demonstrated surprising resilience. Local reports cited by Iran's Tasnim news agency claim an F-35 stealth fighter was downed near Tabriz on June 16th, marking the fourth such jet Iran says it has shot down since hostilities began. While these accounts remain unverified by independent sources, they underscore Tehran's determination to push back. From the outset, Washington has balanced firm support for its Israeli ally with caution about a direct U.S. military role. Publicly, President Donald J. Trump has urged diplomacy, likening himself to a mediator who brokered peace between India and Pakistan. Privately, however, senior Israeli officials pressed the White House for more robust assistance, particularly U.S. air-to-ground firepower and bunker-busting munitions to achieve deep strikes on fortified sites buried beneath Iranian mountains. According to unnamed U.S. sources, Mr. Trump refused Israel's request to assassinate Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, emphasizing that his preferred approach remained diplomatic mediation rather than combat intervention. Yet Israel's own war planners acknowledge that without American logistical support and the latest ordnance, their air raids could only inflict limited short-term damage. Much of Iran's most sensitive infrastructure lies hundreds of meters underground in hardened caverns beyond the reach of conventional Israeli bombs. Even if Israel were to obliterate every known enrichment facility, Tehran could rebuild using existing technical expertise and stockpiled equipment. Accordingly, senior Israeli strategists concede that their campaign's long-term goal, crippling Iran's nuclear ambitions, may ultimately be unattainable without direct U.S. engagement. Meanwhile, on the diplomatic front, the White House's stance has unsettled Tehran. President Trump's calls for an immediate ceasefire sooner rather than later have been met with scorn by hardliners in Iran's parliament, who argue that only decisive military action can deter future aggression. Foreign Ministry spokesman Saeed Bagheri warned on June 16th that Iran would consider withdrawing from the new Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty if Israel's air raids continued. While formally still committed to the NPT, under which Iran forswears nuclear weapons in exchange for peaceful energy development, Iranian legislators are drafting binding legislation to renegotiate or even exit the treaty whenever they deem Israel's attacks intolerable. On the battlefield cartoon of headlines, President Trump's messaging has taken on a dual tone. On social media, he implored Tehran to negotiate and avoid further bloodshed. On the conflict's periphery, however, he authorized the deployment of over 30 American aerial refueling tankers to the Middle East. Military observers view this unprecedented logistical surge revealed in reports from Military World as a possible prelude to deeper U.S. military involvement or expanded cooperation with the Israeli Air Force. U.S. defense officials emphasize that no combat forces have been ordered into the theater, but the repositioning of strategic assets underscores Washington's readiness to act should American interests be threatened. Back in Tehran, Supreme Leader Khamenei denounced Israel's air campaign as a desperate attempt to delay Iran's rise as a regional power. In a speech to Parliament on June 16th, President Ebrahim Raisi reiterated that Iran's nuclear program remains peaceful and subject to IAEA oversight, but he stressed Iran reserves the right to accelerate uranium enrichment if our security is compromised. Raisi's assurances came as inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency reported significant damage to the Isfahan uranium conversion facility some 400 kilometers south of Tehran. The IAEA noted that the strikes have set back conversion operations by several months, yet agency experts caution that complete destruction of Iran's nuclear capacity is still beyond Israel's reach. In Israel, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has repeatedly called on ordinary Iranians to rise up against their government, predicting that sustained pressure would empower internal dissent. However, history suggests that large-scale bombing campaigns often bolster national unity in the face of foreign attack. Recent polling indicates a surge in support for Iran's leadership among citizens angered by the Israeli strikes. Whether public sentiment will hold once the initial shock fades remains to be seen. But for now, Tehran appears more galvanized than divided. Beyond the Middle East, reactions have rippled across the globe. In Eastern Europe, Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky warned that Russia might exploit regional instability to advance its own interests. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov denied any immediate plan to benefit militarily from the conflict, but affirmed Moscow's support for Iran's right to self-defense. Meanwhile, NATO allies remain deeply divided. Some Eastern members urge solidarity with Israel, fearing Iran's ballistic missiles could soon threaten Europe, while several Western capitals, including Berlin and Paris, push for restraint and a return to diplomatic channels. Economic reverberations are already evident. Oil prices briefly spiked above $78 per barrel on June 13th, reflecting concerns that Iran might close the Strait of Hormuz, a choke point through which 20% of global petroleum transits. Market analysts caution that even a temporary disruption could send energy costs spiraling above $100 per barrel, with profound consequences for global inflation and economic growth. Finally, turning north, the Arctic Circle tensions in Eastern Europe persist. Russia's recent proposal outlined on June 16th by Deputy Foreign Minister Alexander Grushko that Ukraine must destroy Western-supplied weapons before any ceasefire talks can resume has been staunchly rejected by Kiev. President Zelensky affirmed that Ukraine cannot accept ultimatums that undermine its sovereignty. In Kiev's view, NATO and EU support are essential to repel further Russian advances. As the sun sets on the Middle East this evening, the conflict between Israel and Iran stands at a dangerous inflection point. Israel's air campaign has demonstrated tactical prowess, yet its strategic objectives may prove elusive without expanded support from the United States. And Iran, resilient and defiant, has shown an ability to absorb blows and retaliate with both kinetic strikes on Israeli cities and legislative moves that threaten the nuclear status quo. Diplomacy hangs by a thread, and world leaders from Washington to Brussels are grappling with the risk of a regional conflagration spiraling into a wider war. Stay with us for continuing coverage, expert analysis, and up-to-the-minute updates on this critical story. In the United States, the conflict's impact has reverberated far beyond diplomatic cables and combat operations. On June 16th, President Trump issued an urgent call for all U.S. citizens to evacuate Tehran, immediately framing the request as a humanitarian necessity amid escalating hostilities. Yet domestically, the president's posture has been sharply contested. Beneath the public veneer of restraint, the White House quietly ordered a large-scale surge of aerial refueling tankers, KC-135s and KC-46s, into the Middle East, signaling readiness to support Allied air operations or, if necessary, enable U.S. aircraft sorties. Pentagon officials insist no combat troops will be deployed without explicit authorization, but congressional leaders on both sides of the aisle are pressing for clarity on the administration's red lines and rules of engagement. Meanwhile, within the U.S., June has been marked by surging political unrest over immigration policy. President Trump, in a social media broadcast on June 15th, directed Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, to launch the largest deportation operation in American history, specifically targeting major Democratic-run cities such as Los Angeles, Chicago, and New York. That directive prompted immediate legal challenges from the governors of California and Illinois, who argued that federal agents lack jurisdictional authority to conduct mass removals on local soil. The standoff underscores a broader battle over the scope of federal power and the human costs of immigration enforcement debates now unfolding in parallel with U.S. diplomacy in the Middle East. On the economic front, ripple effects of the Israel-Iran clash are equally acute. Energy markets remain on edge. Brent crude briefly surged to $78 per barrel on June 13th, amid angst over potential disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz, the maritime choke point through which 20% of the world's oil exports flow. Analysts warn that any Iranian decision to block tanker traffic could drive prices north of $100 per barrel, exacerbating inflationary pressures already weighing on global growth. U.S. Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm and her counterparts in Europe have convened emergency meetings to discuss contingency plans, including strategic petroleum reserves releases and accelerated renewable energy deployments. Across the Atlantic, G7 leaders gathered in Canada for a June summit clouded by Middle East tensions and transatlantic divisions. At a joint press conference on June 16th, the European Commission, President Ursula von der Leyen and European Council President Charles Michel jointly admonished the Trump administration against trade unilateralism even as they backed Israel's right to self-defense. They stressed the imperative of keeping global markets open and maintaining unity on defense spending without resorting to protectionist measures. Their comments reflect deep unease in Brussels and Berlin. While Europe stands behind NATO's Article 5, its economies remain acutely vulnerable to energy shortages and supply chain disruptions triggered by geopolitical upheaval. In Asia, shockwaves have been felt in New Delhi, where the Indian Navy accommodated an emergency landing of a British F-35B stealth fighter on June 14th. The aircraft, part of the HMS Prince of Wales carrier strike group, diverted to Thiruvananthapuram when icing conditions at sea threatened its safe recovery on deck. The Indian Air Force facilitated the landing and technical inspections showcasing robust defense cooperation between India and the United Kingdom. New Delhi, mindful of the fragile regional security environment, signaled its willingness to host allied platforms in exigent circumstances, marking a notable expansion of India's defense diplomacy that traditionally emphasizes strategic autonomy. Meanwhile, back in the Middle East, Israel's home front remains on high alert. The Iran-backed Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps IRGC touted a novel missile tactic on June 15th by configuring overlapping trajectories. IRGC salvos allegedly confused Israel's multi-layered Arrow and Iron Dome defenses, causing some batteries to inadvertently target each other. While Israeli authorities have neither confirmed nor denied these specific claims, the IRGC's boasts highlight the evolving cat-and-mouse dynamic between offensive missile technology and adaptive air defense networks. Turning now to Europe's eastern flank, the conflict has cast a long shadow over the Ukraine battlefield. On June 16th, Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister Alexander Grishko reiterated Moscow's precondition for Ukraine: destroy all Western-supplied weaponry before negotiations can resume on a ceasefire. Kiev's leadership, including President Volodymyr Zelensky, has unequivocally rejected these demands as non-starters. Instead, Ukraine continues to press NATO and EU partners for advanced air defense systems to protect critical infrastructure against renewed Russian strikes, concerns reignited by Tehran's assaults on Israel that distract Western attention from Ukraine's plight. Simultaneously, Kiev's intelligence services reportedly mounted a daring cross-border raid on June 15th against a UAV manufacturing facility in Yelabuga, Tatarstan, deep inside Russian territory. Ukrainian Special Operations Forces are said to have destroyed unmanned combat drones that Moscow was developing for future strikes. While Russia's Ministry of Defense neither confirmed nor denied the incident, The audacious operation, if verified, underscores Ukraine's growing capability and willingness to strike Russian assets far behind frontline lines. Closer to home, the single deadliest aviation disaster in recent memory grabbed headlines worldwide. On June 12th, Air India Flight 171, a Boeing 787 Dreamliner bound for Delhi with 242 souls aboard, crashed mere seconds after liftoff, plowing into a dormitory complex adjacent to Mumbai's runway and erupting into a massive fireball. Investigators from the Indian Directorate General of Civil Aviation have identified engine failure as a likely culprit, but Boeing is facing renewed scrutiny over the 787's design and maintenance protocols. Survivors recount scenes of chaos as fleeing passengers passed through fiery plumes, and global carriers have since grounded similar Dreamliner models pending safety inspections. The tragedy, which claimed 280 lives in total, has reignited debates over aircraft certification standards and emergency response readiness. In Central Asia, another aviation milestone quietly emerged against the backdrop of heightened global tensions. On June 14th, Kazakhstan officially launched construction on its first nuclear power plant in over 2 decades this time, with a geopolitically significant partnership model. Rosatom, the Russian state nuclear corporation, will lead the first reactor build near Ulkan-Kin, leveraging its Generation 3 Plus VVR 1200 technology. Simultaneously, China National Nuclear Corporation, CNNC, will spearhead a separate reactor project at a second site. Astana's choice of both Moscow and Beijing signals an intent to balance great power influence and secure long-term energy diversification, moving beyond its current reliance on coal and hydropower. Despite such forays into civilian nuclear energy, Kazakhstan's broader foreign policy remains acutely mindful of regional conflict dynamics. Astana has temporarily closed its border crossings with neighboring Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, citing security precautions amid spillover fears from the Middle East turmoil. Yet diplomats from all parties emphasize that trade and transit corridors will remain largely open, mitigating economic disruption for Central Asian states that depend on Kazakh oil and gas exports. As we draw our coverage to a close, the global security landscape presents a tableau of interlocking crises, from the skies over Iran and Israel to the battlefields of Ukraine, from the ships plying the Strait of Hormuz to the runway of Mumbai's international airport. The civilian and military repercussions are reverberating through markets, alliances, and domestic politics alike. Whether diplomacy can reassert itself before these conflicts cascade further remains the pressing question of our time. Turning now to South Asia, our next story concerns an unexpected diversion of a cutting-edge fighter jet. On June 14th, an F-35B Lightning II assigned to the Royal Navy's HMS Prince of Wales Carrier Strike Group was forced to divert to Thiruvananthapuram International Airport in Kerala after icing conditions on the carrier deck made a safe vertical landing impossible. The Stovall short takeoff vertical landing variant is designed for operations from smaller decks, but in heavy sea spray and crosswinds, deck temperatures fell below operational minima. Naval aviators prudently shut down their mission over the Arabian Sea and requested emergency landing clearance from Indian Air Force controllers. At 22:30 local time, the F-35B touched down without incident. Ground crews immediately began structural and engine inspection of its Pratt & Whitney F-135 power plant. Britain's Ministry of Defense and India's Ministry of Defense have coordinated refueling and technical checks to prepare the jet for safe recovery once sea conditions improve. This episode highlights the logistical complexities of fifth-generation aircraft at sea and the value of allied interoperability in real-time contingencies. Meanwhile, onshore in India, investigators continue to examine wreckage from the June 12th crash of Air India Flight 171, a Boeing 787 Dreamliner that plunged into a dormitory building seconds after takeoff from Mumbai's Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj International Airport. Of the 242 people aboard, only one survived the initial impact. The ensuing fire claimed 279 lives, marking India's deadliest civilian aviation disaster in decades. Eyewitnesses described the jet veering off the runway trailing burning debris before colliding with the three-story structure. Preliminary findings by India's Directorate General of Civil Aviation DGCA point to an uncontained failure in one Rolls-Royce Trent 1000 engine. Recovered fan blades and turbine discs show high cycle fatigue fractures. Boeing and Rolls-Royce teams are assisting Indian authorities with metallurgical analyses and maintenance record reviews. Records indicate the aircraft's last major engine shop visit occurred 18 months ago with no outstanding airworthiness directives at the time of departure. In response, several airlines operating 787s have temporarily grounded Dreamliners for safety inspections. The U.S. Federal Aviation Administration issued an emergency airworthiness directive on June 15th, mandating ultrasonic and borescope inspections of Trent 1000 fan discs within 14 days. Boeing's Commercial Airplanes Division pledged full cooperation and accelerated retrofits of the Trent 1010, which features redesigned midshafts and upgraded alloys to mitigate fatigue risks. Civil aviation experts note that uncontained engine failures where debris breaches the engine cowling are among the most serious emergencies. They credit the 787's composite fuselage and redundant systems with preserving cockpit integrity during the failure sequence. Had the engines not failed in rapid succession, pilots might have attempted a diversion. Tragically, simultaneous loss of thrust rendered controlled flight impossible. Air India announced compensation payments of $350 lakh approx, USD 63,000 to each victim's family, and raised 10 lakh USD 12,600 to the sole survivor who remains in critical care. Prime Minister Narendra Modi extended condolences and directed expedited crash response and investigation. The DGCA has also ordered a review of runway safety areas buffer zones designed to prevent excursions into adjacent infrastructure. As night falls across the northern hemisphere, these incidents in F-35 diverted for safety and a Dreamliner tragedy underscore the razor's edge where advanced technology, strategic imperatives, and human resilience intersect in today's high-stakes geopolitical and aviation arenas. Continuing our in-depth coverage, we now turn to unfolding dynamics in Eastern Europe and the broader implications for NATO's collective defense posture. On June 16th, Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Alexander Grushko reiterated Moscow's demand that Ukraine dismantle all Western-supplied weaponry before any ceasefire negotiations can proceed. Kiev's leadership, led by President Volodymyr Zelensky, categorically rejects this ultimatum, affirming that such preconditions undermine Ukraine's sovereignty and defense needs. In response, Ukraine has redoubled its appeals for advanced air defense systems from NATO partners, emphasizing the necessity of protecting civilian infrastructure and energy facilities against renewed Russian missile strikes. Intelligence sources in Kyiv further revealed discussions at the highest level about a contingency operation in Transnistria, the pro-Russian breakaway region of Moldova. President Zelensky and Moldovan President Maya Sandu reportedly explored the tactical merits of targeting Russian peacekeeper positions and Soviet-era arms depots located there. Proponents argue that striking these assets could force Russia to divert troops away from the Donbass front, relieving pressure on Ukrainian defenders. Critics warn that any such action risks drawing Moldova and, by extension, the EU into direct conflict, potentially widening the war. In the Black Sea, Kyiv and NATO have bolstered naval patrols after reports on June 15th that Iranian-made anti-ship missiles were loaded onto Russian cargo vessels bound for Sevastopol. Ukraine's military intelligence warns these weapons could enter the Black Sea Fleet's arsenal to threaten commercial shipping and project force onto the Ukrainian littoral. In response, Romania and Turkey have conducted joint naval exercises in the Bosporus and off Constanza, safeguarding vital grain export corridors essential to both Ukraine's economy and global food security. Further north, Finland and Sweden continue to integrate into NATO's defense framework ahead of their formal membership. On June 17th, Finnish Chief of Defense General Timo Kivinen and Swedish Supreme Commander General Mikael Biden met with NATO's Supreme Allied Commander, Europe General Christopher Cavoli, in Brussels. The agenda centered on enhancing joint air defense coverage across the Baltic region, countering the prospect of Russian cruise missile overflights from the Barents Sea and electronic warfare threats to Allied radar installations. Back in the United States, President Trump's June directive for a major ICE operation in Democratic-run cities has sparked legal injunctions from California and New York governors. Federal agents are barred from conducting mass deportations without state cooperation, highlighting tensions between federal authority and sanctuary jurisdictions. Both sides have mobilized their legal teams, setting the stage for what may become a protracted constitutional clash. Simultaneously, Congress is grappling with wartime budgeting pressures. Legislators must balance continuing funds for Ukraine's military aid, support for Middle East contingents, and domestic disaster relief following record spring storms. Analysts estimate that U.S. security assistance appropriations could exceed $50 billion by year-end, prompting calls from fiscal conservatives for offsetting cuts in other spending areas. In Israel and the Palestinian territories, the human toll mounts. Since June 13th, the IDF's air offensive has displaced over 200,000 Gazans, many sheltering in Unarwe schools ill-equipped for summer heat. On June 15th, Israeli authorities tightened West Bank movement restrictions, adding checkpoints around Ramallah, Hebron, and Nablus. Palestinian farmers report harvest losses as they're barred from fields, while UNRWA warns that prolonged closures threaten humanitarian supply chains. Meanwhile, on June 16th, Israel approved plans for 22 new Jewish settlements in the occupied West Bank. The UN, United Kingdom, and Jordan condemned the expansion as illegal under international law and an obstacle to a two-state solution. Secretary General Antonio Guterres called for an immediate halt, stressing that settlements undermine prospects for lasting peace. In Africa's Sahel, Niger's military junta, already at odds with Iran over alleged militia support, hosted an ECOWAS emergency meeting on June 17th. Niamey warned that increased Iranian activity in Libya and Mali could embolden extremist groups. ECOWAS observers recommended bolstering UN peacekeeping forces and improving intelligence sharing across the region. In the Horn of Africa, Djibouti convened its Foreign Ministerial Committee on June 17th to assess risks to Red Sea shipping, with Iranian-aligned Houthi missiles menacing Gulf traffic. Regional navies, including those of Djibouti, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia, offered coordinated patrols, yet persistent Houthi threats mean commercial vessels remain on high alert. Energy markets remain volatile. After Brent crude spiked to $78 per barrel on June 13th, European natural gas futures rose 5% on June 16th, amid fears Iran might mine the Strait of Hormuz or target Gulf export terminals. On June 17th, the WTO launched a review of trade flows through Middle Eastern choke points, exploring measures such as alternative shipping routes around the Cape of Good Hope and increased LNG shipments to Europe. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International issued joint statements on June 17th condemning indiscriminate strikes by all parties and calling for full humanitarian access. They urged probes into alleged war crimes and reaffirmed that belligerents must adhere to international humanitarian law. Concurrently, the IAEA convened an extraordinary board meeting in Vienna. Director General Rafael Grossi warned that damage to Iran's Isfahan conversion plant and security breaches at other nuclear sites threaten safeguards. Member states called for more inspectors, while Iran cautioned against using IAEA inspections as a pretext for military targeting. As these interwoven crises, from Eastern Europe's strategic openings to the humanitarian emergency in the Levant, intensify, the international community faces unparalleled challenges. Coordination among allies, robust diplomacy, and unwavering support for civilians caught in the crossfire have never been more critical. On June 16th, Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Alexander Grushko reiterated Moscow's insistence that Ukraine must dismantle all Western-supplied weaponry before any ceasefire talks can proceed. Kiev's leadership, headed by President Volodymyr Zelensky, categorically rejects this ultimatum as non-viable and inconsistent with Ukraine's sovereignty and defense needs. Instead, Ukraine has intensified its appeals for advanced air defense systems from NATO partners, citing the critical vulnerability of civilian infrastructure and energy facilities to renewed Russian missile strikes. Against that backdrop, intelligence sources in Kiev indicate a covert Ukrainian plan to open a second front in Transnistria, the breakaway Moldovan territory hosting Russian peacekeepers and legacy Soviet arms caches. In discussions between President Zelensky and Moldovan President Maya Sandu during her June visit, Kiev explored the tactical merits of striking Russian positions in Transnistria to disrupt Moscow's ability to reinforce its main axis in Donbass. Proponents argue such an operation could force Russia to divert troops and material away from Ukraine's eastern front, easing pressure on Ukrainian defenders. Critics warn, however, that any military action in Transnistria risks dragging Moldova into active hostilities and could trigger a diplomatic crisis with the European Union, which regards Transnistria as a frozen conflict zone. Shifting focus to the Black Sea, both Ukraine and NATO have reinforced naval patrols following reports on June 15th that Iranian-supplied anti-ship missiles were being covertly transported via Russian cargo vessels. Kiev's military intelligence warns that Moscow may transfer these weapons to its Black Sea fleet to threaten commercial shipping and project power ashore. In response, the Romanian and Turkish navies have stepped up joint exercises in the Bosporus and off the coast of Constanza, working to secure vital grain export routes that sustain both Ukraine's economy and global food supplies. Meanwhile, in Scandinavia, Finland and Sweden continue integrating their defense planning into NATO structures ahead of formal accession. On June 17th, Finnish Chief of Defense General Timo Kivinen and Swedish Supreme Commander General Mikael Biden held a trilateral meeting with NATO's Supreme Allied Commander General Christopher Cavoli in Brussels. The talks focused on enhancing joint air defense capabilities along NATO's northern flank, particularly important given the prospect of Russian cruise missile overflights in the Barents Sea and potential electronic warfare disruptions near Murmansk military installations. Turning now to North America, domestic concerns in the United States have paralleled foreign policy crises. In mid-June, President Trump's directive for a major ICE operation in Democratic-run cities sparked a wave of legal challenges. Governors in California and New York obtained injunctions barring federal agents from conducting mass deportations without state cooperation. The resulting standoff underscores tensions between federal authority and so-called sanctuary jurisdictions, with both sides mobilizing their legal teams for what may become a protracted courtroom battle. Economically, the U.S. Congress is also grappling with the budgetary impact of simultaneous crises. Lawmakers must reconcile funding for Ukraine's military assistance, reinforcement of Middle East contingents, and domestic disaster relief for communities hit by extreme weather in late spring. Financial analysts estimate that direct U.S. appropriations for foreign security assistance could exceed $50 billion by year-end, prompting calls from fiscal conservatives to offset costs with spending cuts elsewhere. Back in the Middle East, humanitarian conditions in Gaza and the West Bank continue to deteriorate. UNRWA reports that over 200,000 Palestinians have been displaced since Israel's air campaign began on June 13th, with more than half seeking shelter In UN-run schools ill-equipped for winter to summer transitions. Meanwhile, Israeli authorities have approved plans for 22 new settlements in the occupied West Bank, moves condemned by the UN, the EU, and Jordan as violations of international law and obstacles to a two-state solution. Tensions have spiked along the separation barrier, where clashes between IDF patrols and Palestinian youths have resulted in multiple injuries on both sides. In Africa's Sahel region, governments are watching closely for any spillover from the Israel-Iran standoff. Niger's military junta, which has already suspended relations with Iran over alleged support for local insurgent groups, convened an emergency meeting of ECOWAS envoys on June 17th. Niamey expressed concern that increased Iranian activity in Libya and Mali could embolden extremist networks and threaten regional security. ECOWAS observers recommended boosting UN peacekeeping contingents and enhancing intelligence sharing among Sahel states. On the diplomatic front, diplomatic cables leaked on June 16th reveal that China has offered mediation services to both Israel and Iran. Beijing's proposal, circulated quietly through the UN Secretariat, suggests a phased de-escalation, a temporary ceasefire followed by reciprocal inspections of nuclear and missile sites under IAEA and UN supervision. While both Tel Aviv and Tehran have yet to formally accept China's offer, the move underscores Beijing's ambition to position itself as a global peace broker amid perceptions of U.S. hesitancy. In Southeast Asia, ASEAN foreign ministers expressed unified concern over maritime security in the Strait of Malacca, where heightened tensions in the Middle East have driven some shipping firms to reroute cargoes via longer Indian Ocean paths. On June 17th, Indonesia's coordinating minister for maritime affairs convened a virtual summit with Malaysian and Singaporean counterparts to discuss coordinated patrols, emergency communication protocols, and potential relief measures for shipping companies facing fuel cost spikes. Finally, turning to North Atlantic energy markets, oil and gas prices remain volatile. After Brent crude hit $78 per barrel on June 13th, futures settled back to the mid-70s by June 17th as traders weighed the probability of U.S. strategic petroleum reserve releases and OPEC Plus production calibrations. Natural gas benchmarks in Europe, meanwhile, spiked 5% on June 16th amid speculation that Iran might deploy naval mines in the Strait of Hormuz. Energy ministers from Germany, France, and Italy have convened in Brussels on June 18th to explore joint interventions ranging from LNG imports via new Mediterranean regasification terminals to accelerated wind and solar projects under the EU's REPowerEU initiative. As these multiple crises intersect, from Eastern Europe's battlefields to the waterways of the Middle East, from North America's domestic politics to Central Asia's nuclear aspirations, the need for coordinated international leadership has never been clearer. In our final segment, we'll assess how multilateral institutions are adapting to this era of overlapping security, economic, and humanitarian challenges. In Brazil, President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva convened an emergency economic council on June 17th to address the knock-on effects of Middle Eastern oil price volatility on Brazil's rampant inflation and social programs. With Brent crude hovering above $75 per barrel, Finance Minister Fernando Haddad announced temporary reductions in fuel subsidies and fast-track grain imports from Argentina to stabilize food and transport costs. Behind closed doors, Brazilian diplomats engaged counterparts in Venezuela and Colombia to establish contingency fuel corridors, anticipating any closure of the Strait of Hormuz might choke Atlantic shipping lanes. Meanwhile, Mexico City's President Andrés Manuel López Obrador praised Brazil's agility and proposed a Mercosur Pacific Alliance energy task force to negotiate collective pricing, with OPEC Plus producers signaling Latin America's intent to assert greater influence over global commodity markets. In Southeast Asia, Indonesia's coordinating minister for maritime affairs hosted an urgent trilateral virtual summit with Malaysia and Singapore on June 17th to safeguard the Strait of Malacca trade artery, with Houthi missile threats in the Red Sea forcing some shipping lines to reroute via the Cape of Good Hope. Asian exporters and importers alike face steep fuel and time penalties. The three nations agreed to share real-time intelligence coordinate patrols of critical choke points and explore cost-sharing mechanisms for naval escort operations to protect merchant vessels against asymmetric attacks. In the Taiwan Strait, a PLA Navy frigate on June 16th shadowed a U.S. Coast Guard cutter transiting the Bashi Channel between Taiwan and the Philippines, prompting an urgent maritime safety bulletin from U.S. 7th Fleet Command. The cutter's lawful innocent passage under international law was met with unsafe and unprofessional maneuvers, according to Pentagon sources. Taipei dispatched fast attack craft to monitor the encounter, while Tokyo's Ministry of Defense condemned the harassment as part of an increasingly aggressive PRC naval posture aimed at deterring Allied freedom of navigation operations. In response, the U.S. and Japanese navies expanded joint exercises in the Philippine Sea to include simulated escort and emergency rescue drills for Coast Guard vessels operating in contested waters. On the Korean Peninsula, Seoul and Washington reacted sharply to North Korea's June 16th ballistic missile test over the Yellow Sea. Despite Pyongyang's claim that the launch was routine training, South Korea's National Security Council convened an emergency session. President Yoon Suk-yeol authorized the deployment of additional U.S.-made Patriot PAC-3 air defense batteries to key industrial centers in the southeast, while the Pentagon confirmed redeployment of a terminal high-altitude area defense THAAD battery to bolster southern troops. Joint USS aerial patrols resumed along the demilitarized zone within hours, underscoring NATO-level interoperability and signaling to Pyongyang that provocations will be met with robust deterrence. In Tokyo, Prime Minister Fumio Kishida telephoned Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese to discuss the latest DPRK test and coordinate a combined diplomatic and military response through the Quad framework. Both leaders reaffirmed support for UN Security Council resolutions and pledged to push for tighter sanctions enforcement, especially on illicit shipping channels used to funnel North Korean weapons exports through East Asian ports. Turning to Africa's Sahel, Niger's junta-organized NECOWAS summit on June 17th, warning that increased Iranian influence in Libya and Mali could embolden extremist factions. Observers recommended reinforcing UN-May peacekeepers and enhancing cross-border drone surveillance, though some Nigerian delegates expressed skepticism over UN effectiveness, preferring regional solutions under the G5 Sahel mechanism. Concurrently in Djibouti, which hosts major foreign naval bases, an emergency meeting of foreign ministers on June 17th reviewed Red Sea security after reports of Iranian-backed Houthi missile strikes on merchant ships. Djibouti's minister proposed a multilateral maritime coordination center to synchronize patrols among Gulf Cooperation Council members, European Union, NAV4 officers, and African navies, a concept still under negotiation. Back in the Middle East, cross-border humanitarian corridors remain perilously narrow. UNRWA recently reported that some 220,000 Gazans are sheltering in overcrowded schools, with water and medical supplies running critically low. On June 16th, Israeli authorities closed additional crossing points into the West Bank, citing security threats, while approving 22 new settlements, moves roundly condemned by the United Nations, the European Union, and Jordan as illegal under international law. Secretary General Antonio Guterres reiterated that settlement expansion poisons the prospects for two-state peace and urged immediate reversal. In Europe, NATO's northern flank continues to solidify. On June 17th in Brussels, Finland's Chief of Defense General Timo Kivinen and Sweden's Supreme Commander General Mikael Biden met NATO Supreme Allied Commander Europe General Christopher Cavoli to finalize integration plans. Their focus synchronizing air defense radars across the Baltic states, deploying additional Patriot batteries in Estonia, and enhancing joint drills in the Arctic Circle to counter potential Russian cruise missile incursions, and electronic jamming. Meanwhile, Greece and Turkey resumed high-level discussions over Eastern Mediterranean energy exploration amid simmering tensions. Greek Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis and Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan agreed in a June 17th video conference to reopen technical talks on maritime boundary delimitation, forestalling a potentially dangerous naval standoff over offshore natural gas fields near Cyprus. Across the Atlantic, Washington's legal battles over immigration intensify. Federal directives for ICE raids in sanctuary cities prompted California's and New York's attorneys general to secure judicial injunctions. In a June 16th hearing, a U.S. District Court judge questioned the administration's statutory authority, signaling a protracted constitutional showdown. At the same time, Congress faces a ticking clock to fund critical security operations abroad and hurricane relief appropriations at home, with projected foreign assistance bills topping $50 billion pressure that has emboldened budget hawks to demand across-the-board spending cuts. Global commodity markets are equally on edge. After Brent crude peaked at $70 per barrel on June 13th, prices eased back to the mid-$70 range by June 17th, amid talk of strategic petroleum reserve releases in the U.S., and discussions within OPEC Plus about output increases. European natural gas futures, however, surged 6% on June 17th after traders speculated Iran might mine the Strait of Hormuz in retaliation for Israeli strikes on its nuclear facilities, threatening LNG shipments to Europe on the Persian Gulf route. Human rights organizations seized the moment. On June 17th, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International issued a joint appeal urging all parties in the Israel-Iran conflict to respect civilian protections and allow unfettered aid deliveries. Both groups called for immediate, impartial investigations into alleged violations of international humanitarian law, citing civilian casualties and infrastructure damage in densely populated areas. Finally, the International Atomic Energy Agency held an extraordinary board meeting in Vienna. On June 17th, Director General Rafael Grossi warned that recent Israeli air raids on Iran's Isfahan uranium conversion plant and reported security breaches at other nuclear sites could undermine safeguards. Member states agreed to deploy additional inspectors to Iran, even as Tehran protested that inspections should not be used to facilitate further military targeting. With 7 parts spanning one continuous hour of coverage, we have navigated global flashpoints, from South Asia's carrier operations and Latin America's energy strategies to Europe's security recalibrations and the simmering humanitarian crisis in the Levant, underscoring the intricate nexus of military, economic, and human challenges defining our era. In eastern Ukraine, the front line remains fiercely contested. Since June 15th, Russian forces have launched repeated assaults along the Sumy axis, probing Ukrainian defenses near Yunakovka and Novopol, although they briefly seized parts of villages like Malinka and Myropolya. Kyiv's troops repelled 39 attacks and restored positions by dawn on June 16th, inflicting an estimated 136 Russian casualties. In Donetsk Oblast, fighting intensified around Popasna, Novopavlivka, and Vuhledar, where Russian artillery and drones pressed Ukrainian lines but failed to achieve breakthrough. Overnight drone raids targeted an unmanned combat UAV facility in Yelabuga, Tatarstan, marking one of the deepest Ukrainian strikes on Russian territory. The attack, if confirmed, highlights Kyiv's growing long-range strike capability aimed at disrupting Moscow's drone production. Despite Western sanctions, Russia's export economy defied expectations. A June 14th report by the German Institute for Economic Research found that Russian non-energy exports rose 18% in 2024 versus 2021, totaling roughly $330 billion, and signaling Moscow's ability to reroute trade to Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Key partners include China, India, Turkey, and Brazil, which have sustained purchases of oil, gas, and raw materials. Hungary, and Slovakia remain significant EU recipients, underscoring persistent intra-European dependencies despite political tensions. Back in Central Asia, Kazakhstan's dual nuclear projects with Russia's Rosatom and China's CNNC proceeded apace, reinforcing Astana's strategy of energy diversification. Meanwhile, Elon Musk's Starlink satellites played an unexpected role in Iran, where nationwide internet blackouts prompted activists and some government entities to route traffic through SpaceX's low Earth orbit constellation, ensuring limited connectivity despite Tehran's efforts to suppress online dissent. On South Asia's western flank, Pakistan closed all border crossings with Iran on June 16th, citing regional security pressures. Yet trade in essential goods continues via sealed corridors, and over 450 Pakistani evacuees have returned from Iran and Iraq since mid-June. Iran's Civil Aviation Authority extended its no-fly ban through June 17th, prompting Flydubai Tehran and Romania's Taram to suspend flights to Tehran until at least June 20th, disrupting pilgrimage and business travel across the region. In Europe's skies, the Paris Air Show 2025 opened under a diplomatic chill when French authorities confined 5 Israeli defense exhibitors off-site, citing policy violations of non-aggression principles. The move drew criticism from Germany and the UK, which view French restrictions as politicizing a commercial event that traditionally showcases civilian and military aerospace technology side by side. Finally, Iran's defense ministry on June 16th unveiled the Hakim cruise missile first tested in April 2024, and now operational, boasting a 1 of 400-kilometer range of 500 kilo warhead, and the ability to evade advanced radars at Mach 5 re-entry speeds. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei lauded Hakim as a strategic deterrent against any future aggression, pledging to further bolster Iran's missile forces, even as President Ibrahim Raisi reaffirmed in Parliament on June 17th that Iran's nuclear program remains peaceful and firmly under IAEA inspection. As these simultaneous developments, from Donbass battlefields and cross-border drone raids to nuclear energy partnerships and high-tech missile unveilings, unfold around the globe, one constant emerges: the interplay of military innovation, economic resilience, and strategic alliances continues to reshape 21st century geopolitics at breathtaking speed.